Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Khosrau and Anushirawan Part 3, The Immortal Soul by Extra History. So this is the third episode in our series on Khosrau. Last time we saw Khosrau truly cementing his position as Shah of the Sassanid Empire by defeating a rebellion that came from his brother. We saw Justinian enter the picture, and he's going to be an important character, I imagine, through the rest of this series. I think Justinian and Khosrau have many parallels, as we might see in these videos. Anyway, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out the Patreon, which is linked in the description, or channel memberships, which you can check out by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. And if you join the Patreon or channel memberships, you will get access to exclusive reaction videos. Pretty enticing, huh? Anyway, with that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
When Khosrau defeated Mazdak and put down his brother's rebellion,
For those that don't remember, Mazdak was this religious/political figure who was the leader of this new religion that in many ways was kind of proto-communist. It was about equal distribution of land and wealth and giving food to those who needed it. They were called the Mazdakites. And like I said, it was this interesting mix of new religion and social/political movement. In fact, Khosrau's father had allied with them at one point, but they became a bit of a nuisance, so he tried to distance himself, and Khosrau's brother, who had risen in rebellion, was allied with Mazdak. But, of course, Khosrau has put all of that down. That is now behind him.
the priest gave him a new name, Anushirawan, the Immortal Soul.
I was wondering where that came from. Anushirawan, okay.
It was an honor that he intended to earn.
Alright. It's a pretty impressive title, though. Being Shah of the Sassanid Empire, being King of Kings, that's already an impressive title.
Upon coming into his own, Khosrau burst into a flurry of action nearly unparalleled in history. He reformed almost every aspect of the empire.
And, by the way, I think this is where some of this is starting. I talked about how there are a lot of parallels between Khosrau and Justinian. I think we're already seeing that. We have two very ambitious leaders who immediately launch into a series of reforms and policy changes. So just sort of keep that comparison in mind when we're watching this series.
Trying to fix those broken systems that had nearly doomed his father's reign and guiding Iran into a new golden age. Both his and his father's successions had nearly been derailed by pressures on their army. It turns out that structuring your military as a single unified force means that it can only serve on one side of the empire at a time.
As we saw, Kavad, Khosrau's father, had a lot of issues holding on to his authority, and Khosrau has had a lot of issues holding on to his power as well. And it's interesting where I think talking about reforming the army to make it a little more mobile, maybe split it up. I'm curious to see what we're going to get, but that's exactly what the Romans did.
And a single defeat, or even an overcommitment to a single border, could easily leave you scrambling for emergency funds to hire another army at the last minute. Khosrau planned to expand and restructure his military, but to do that, he was gonna need money. His father, who had recognized this same issue, had long ago begun a property survey of the entire empire, cataloging what each citizen owned and what they could afford to pay.
And I mean, that is incredibly, one, useful, and two, impressive for this era. You know, we're still talking about ancient empires, the Romans, the Sassanids, and, you know, it's pretty remarkable if we think about the years to come, the Middle Ages. It's truly remarkable the amount of power these centralized governments and bureaucracies had. Now, in many ways, the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire were pretty decentralized. These rulers had to work through powerful vassals, powerful landowners, but they were still pretty centralized, and they had powerful bureaucracies, as we can see from this sort of property survey. I mean, that's pretty impressive to perform this sort of census, or at least part of a census, over such a large span of territory and over so many people.
But a survey that long takes forever, so it wasn't complete until Khosrau's time. Khosrau made use of this immediately. He levied new taxes that demanded a fixed amount based on wealth, asking the richest citizens to pay the most. He also required that taxes be paid with coin and...
I mean, makes sense. This is what we call a progressive tax system. Your taxes get higher as you get richer. Of course, this is what almost all countries use today.
not goods. He didn't need his farmers' perishable wheat. He needed gold.
Is interesting. This is also like the, turning backwards on feudalism, or at least that's how I see it from sort of a Western context, because if we look at the Roman Empire, the Roman currency had been very strong for a long time, and then in sort of the latter days of the United Roman Empire, the currency began to become more and more worthless as inflation took a massive toll on it, and so people stopped using coins to buy goods and started trading goods themselves. And this is one of the changes that sort of leads from antiquity, from the United Roman Empire, into the feudalism that spread across Europe. So it's always interesting to see something different, and here we're seeing a move away from what I would see as sort of European feudalism. We're not trading in goods, I don't want your crops, we're going to use gold. Fascinating. And of course, you have to have a pretty powerful empire to enforce that sort of thing.
In the end, people ended up paying higher taxes than they used to, but their tax rate was now consistent, year after year. No more panicked emergency levies. And now, Khosrau could stockpile that non-perishable money for a rainy day. Next on the reform list was tax collection. For generations, the noble families had been responsible for both assessing and collecting taxes. But now that Kavad's land survey had made their assessments irrelevant, Khosrau delivered the killing blow by taking away their ability to collect taxes too.
Wow.
In their place, he created a new upper middle class called the Dagans and appointed them as tax collectors.
Okay, so once again, this is basically another move away from the sort of feudal system that was developing and had developed in Europe. The first part is trading in goods and not in money, paying wheat for your taxes instead of paying money. And of course, the second part, one of the most important facets of feudalism, is the power that local lords and landowners have. For example, collecting taxes to deliver to the king. If you have a powerful centralized empire, then you can create a centralized bureaucracy that can do that tax collecting for you, which gives you a lot of power over these landowners. Of course, that's what the Roman Empire had at one point, but now, if you look at the time that this is happening, a lot of Europe has devolved into feudalism. The Western Roman Empire has collapsed. Justinian's trying to bring it back, but at this point, the Western Roman Empire has collapsed, and so there is no central authority powerful enough to enforce these kind of things. Even the Eastern Roman Empire is not as centralized as the Roman Empire was back in the day. So it's interesting to see Khosrau kind of moving away from that feudal way of doing things, or more decentralized way of doing things, and towards a more, you could call it modern, but towards a more centralized version of government and bureaucracy.
Who answered only to Khosrau and the priests. The nobles could no longer lie about how much wealth their provinces generated, or skim off the top to line their own pockets at the expense of the imperial treasury. Of course, the Dagans eventually became corrupt in their own right, but Khosrau had succeeded where it mattered most to him. He took power away from the noble families and doubled revenues for his empire.
And particularly important, in any system where the nobles hold a lot of power, and you have some sort of king or an emperor, in any system that's feudal or feudal-like, I don't know what you would necessarily call it, but when I think of a system where the king has to work through these powerful landowners, powerful lords, I think that's basically a feudal system. And any system like that, the guy at the top, the king, the emperor, is going to want to disempower these feudal lords. And we've already seen that Kavad wanted to do that because he had troubles with his lords. Khosrau wants to do this, and it seems like he's successfully doing it because he has had trouble with his lords in the past. This is a recurring theme throughout history, throughout these types of hierarchies. I think last time I talked about Louis XIV. He's a good example of an absolute monarch who hundreds, if not 1,000 years later, did what Khosrau is doing right now. He disempowered his lords and centralized more power in his hands. So it was interesting to see this process of centralization occurring many different places and times throughout history.
Now flush with cash, Khosrau could finally afford his military overhaul. He split it into 4 divisions, one for each corner of the empire.
Yeah, this is very similar to what the Eastern Roman Empire did. And to be fair, if you looked at the United Roman Empire, they also divided the army quite a bit. They needed more mobile units that can move throughout the empire. And then you look at the Eastern Roman Empire, and they also had similar reforms. So, very interesting, but it makes sense. This is with the spirit of the era. Yeah, these big empires really can't maintain these big singular armies anymore. They need to cut them into many parts so that they can defend all corners of their territory.
Each division would be led by its own general, and here Khosrau threw the noble families a bone by assigning them command. This was a sly power play too, though, because he made sure that the nobles were never given command of an army in their home region, so they could never consolidate power against him. And
Smart.
where nobles had once been the only class allowed to serve as elite cavalry, Iran's most prestigious unit, Khosrau now allowed the Dagans into that exclusive club. Khosrau had learned well from his father's reign. Kavad had tried to go after the nobles directly by embracing Mazdak, a mistake that nearly cost him the empire. Khosrau, on the other hand, had won the nobles' favor by opposing Mazdak before quietly rooting out their other sources of power and replacing them with the Dagans.
Yep, Khosrau is doing something that, once again, we see a lot of kings do throughout history when they want to take power from their nobles, which is that they will create a new elite class. Now, sometimes that takes the form of ennobling a class of individuals and, making them into competing lords. Sometimes it means creating a different elite class, which is what Khosrau is doing. An elite class that owes their power and their position to him, and so will be loyal to him. And he can use them to, like I said, compete with these noble landowners who have previously held a lot of power, but now Khosrau is sort of intelligently lessening the influence they hold without offending them too much. He's still giving them important military positions and all this stuff, but some of the real power he's taking out of their hands.
A loyal new social class of his own creation. The nobles still had influence, but not enough to threaten Khosrau the way Sukhra once threatened Kavad. And with these reforms, the empire flourished. Khosrau built walls at the 4 key entrances to his empire, making it easier to defend against invaders on all sides. He built a better network of roads so his armies could travel more quickly, and that network enticed even more merchants from China and India along the prosperous Silk Road.
Interesting. So Khosrau's infrastructure, and, infrastructure of this scale in this era can really only be built by these powerful empires. His infrastructure assisted the Silk Road, made it perhaps more effective, more influential. Of course, the Silk Road was this incredibly influential network of trade, as you can see, going all the way from China through to the Levant, to the Middle East. Trade and commercial use was the most important thing, but also ideas, ideology, news would spread down this road. Really one of the most important networks, probably throughout world history.
This influx of trade brought not only wealth, but knowledge. Khosrau imported works on mathematics, astronomy, and
that's exactly what I was saying. The Silk Road, most importantly, is known for its commercial use, but it also brought ideas.
philosophy from India on one side and Rome on the other, hoping to create a court of learning. Iran already had a long history of embracing education. 300 years before Khosrau, the founders of his own Sasanian dynasty had built a university complete with state-funded scholarships and the promise of safety and freedom to all who studied there.
Wow.
That promise...
That seems to me like a pretty, I don't know what you would call it, modern, progressive idea, or I'll phrase it like this, sort of less biased phrasing. It's an idea that we don't often see throughout history. And so whenever we see, the creation of a state-sponsored institution of learning that is supposedly non-biased and open to all types of scholars at any time throughout history, that's pretty remarkable.
Lured refugee scholars from the Eastern Roman Empire, where Justinian had recently banned pagan teachings, leaving the classical Greek scholars from the famous school of Athens with nowhere to go. Khosrau...
That's very interesting. And that is a really important change in the Eastern Roman Empire. Not that that's really what we're focusing on this series, but of course the shift towards Christianity, and over time Christianity would become more and more important. And with the split of East and West, the Byzantine Empire as its own thing, Christianity was so important. It was the main way that the Eastern Romans saw the world. They saw everything through the lens of Christianity, through religion. And so a lot of those old pagan philosophers became less important. Now, that's not to say that they completely forgot about people like Socrates or Aristotle. That's absolutely not true. It's just to say that Christianity and Christian philosophy and the Bible and biblical texts were placed on this pedestal to the detriment of other ideas and other philosophies. It's always interesting to see that the Sassanids sort of provided refuge for some of those ideas. I mean, we know, and we saw this in other videos on the Islamic Golden Age, looking at the Christian world over time, a lot of pagan ideas and these old Greek philosophers sort of went out of style for a long time. Like I said, they were still remembered, and some of their ideas were still in use, but a lot of those classical Greek texts were kept alive by the Islamic world until they had a resurgence in the Christian world during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and those eras. So we're seeing sort of a similar thing where, these pagan scholars or these old Greek philosophies are sort of persecuted by the Christianizing Romans, and so they flee elsewhere, and their ideas are preserved elsewhere. Fascinating.
Welcomed them to his own university with open arms, and they declared him worthy of the title Plato's Philosopher King. The title was nice, but sticking it to Justinian, even nicer. Khosrau took a genuine personal interest in education. He attended a medical conference at the university with physicians from around the world, and after listening to them, he decided to add a hospital to his university.
Wow.
The library he built for it consisted of 259 rooms filled with row upon row of
Oh my god, that is an immense library.
medical texts translated into every language.
Wow.
But even that incredible library was not enough for Khosrau. He wanted to gather all of the knowledge about Iran into one place.
I mean, this seems like an incredible collection of knowledge, particularly for this period of history. Really impressive.
He urged his advisors to collect and write down their history going back to ancient times. Alas, this great collection would be lost several centuries later, but before it disappeared, it provided the basis for Iran's great national epic, the Shahnameh. And the Shahnameh's author came from Khosrau's own Dagan class, as the Dagans would become the empire's leading class of scholars. But Khosrau wasn't done yet. His next
It's interesting. Khosrau creates these Dagans, this new class of elites who are loyal to him and can also perform the purposes that he wants them to perform. Education, collecting taxes, serving in the military, scholarship, that I imagine a lot of these noble lords, these landowners, wouldn't necessarily do because they're tending to their own interests, building their own base of power. But now with this new class of loyal elites, they can do all of these things and really revitalize the Sassanid Empire. Really interesting.
Great challenge would be an attempt to restore the sacred text of Iran's Zoroastrian religion.
Whoa.
Even today, Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest active religions, with roots dating back at least as far as the 5th century BCE, and probably a lot farther. The belief system taught by the prophet Zoroaster had originally been passed down through the oral tradition.
And for those that are unfamiliar, maybe some of you don't know that much about Iran, and you're thinking, well, isn't Iran a Muslim country? Yes, nowadays. But of course, at this point, Islam has not emerged. Now, when Muhammad emerges and Islam starts to spread, Iran will become an important part of the Muslim world. And today, Iran is a vastly majority Muslim country. I mean, the vast majority of Iranians are Muslim. But Iran's traditional religion is Zoroastrianism. And that was true up until the spread of Islam. So this is a really fascinating, and I think today often forgotten part of Iran's history, Iran's religious history.
At one point, those teachings were written down in a great collection known as the Avesta. But when Alexander the Great conquered Iran in 330 BCE, he had burned down the old Shah's palace, and the Avesta with it.
Wow, it's pretty devastating to lose such an important religious text. I'm surprised that there weren't copies or it hadn't spread further. Also, I did not think we were going to be getting an Alexander the Great cameo in this series. I should have known. He's so influential. He pokes his nose into everything. But yeah, that's a pretty devastating loss for your religion.
The oral tradition was all that remained. But in the centuries since that fire, many of Iran's great shahs had attempted to collect and re-record the Avesta from those oral accounts. Khosrau's predecessors had laid much of the groundwork, but he was determined to finish the job. He assigned his priests to review and rationalize their collection, organizing the scattered fragments into a master copy that set the standard for Orthodox faith.
Wow.
Khosrau became a mirror for cultured behavior that upper-class Iranians were expected to follow.
Setting an example for your people. Once again, reminds me of Louis XIV. There are other monarchs who exemplify this sort of thing. Peter the Great is another great example. I'm just using these examples in particular because I know a little bit about them. But someone like Louis or Peter the Great, they modeled behavior that their nobles and their elites would then follow. For example, Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, was a big westernizer. He wanted to modernize and westernize Russia. So he would dress in European fashion, he would eat European foods, he would consume European literature, behave in a very Western manner, and he expected his lords to follow him. And to be fair, he kind of forced them to follow him. But over time, that became normal, that became in vogue. Louis XIV is probably a less coercive example. He set up his palace in Versailles. The way he did things was the way everyone else wanted to do things because, he was the great Sun King. And so Khosrau is doing something very similar, of course, far before either Peter or Louis. Like I said, there are many examples of this. I'm just comparing Khosrau to the ones I'm familiar with. Khosrau is doing all of these things, promoting learning, improving the tax collection system, revitalizing religion, bringing these texts together. Seems like promoting education was a really big thing that he was very much interested in. And so the elites of the empire are going to see that, and they're going to model that behavior. They're going to copy that behavior because he is the king of kings. He is doing what is right, and of course they should follow him. He's setting an example.
Schools for the education of young noblemen began teaching the sciences as well as the courtly arts like poetry and music. And best of all, Khosrau insisted that anybody who wanted respect in Iran become really, really good at board games. After visiting India in search of medical knowledge,
we're also really seeing a lot of important Indian influence. I need to do more Indian history because, the Indian subcontinent, what a massive amount of territory. with a lot of people and a lot of history. But also in particular, Indian science and math has been super influential on the rest of the world. We talked about this in our videos on the Islamic Golden Age. We've already mentioned it in this video, but Indian science and Indian math in particular has been super important for the rest of the world, not to mention what we're about to get to right now.
One of Khosrau's university physicians had brought back the games chess and backgammon.
How about that? That is a pretty important introduction.
Chess had been devised as a military strategy game, teaching players to manage an army in battle formation. Backgammon, on the other hand, quickly acquired new Iranian rules that reflected the random nature of fate in the Zoroastrian belief system. Together, these games taught important lessons about how to control what you can and accept what you can't. And it was through Iran and Khosrau's ever-active trading network with Rome that chess and backgammon traveled to the West and became the games we know today.
Remarkable. So once again, starts from India, as a lot of things do. China gets credit too for, if you look at a lot of inventions throughout history, and you want to trace them back to where they came from, you're going to get a lot of India and China. They've invented an incredible number of things over time. But in particular, chess and backgammon, invented in India. Some of the credit is given to Khosrau and, the Silk Road that, he helped develop some of this infrastructure, spread westwards. And then, of course, chess in particular has become a very popular and influential game throughout the history of the world, the history of Europe. Of course, that's where it spread from the Sassanid Empire, spread further westwards. So it's really interesting to see the spread of ideas and culture and how they can sort of change based on who they're interacting with. I imagine some changes occurred from the original games that were devised in India to, where they ended up throughout Europe, for example.
All of these changes and reforms were the product of a lifetime for Khosrau, but he laid the foundation for them in the very first years of his reign. It was the perfect time. The Hephthalites were busy fending off Turks in the north. The Arabs had allied with Iran and created a buffer zone to the south. And the Romans, under Justinian, had signed a treaty known as the Eternal Peace.
Yep. I always say this every time this comes up. We have a lot of examples of eternal peaces signed throughout history. This is one that I'm particularly familiar with. Have any of these pieces ever been eternal? Maybe some of them have lasted to the present day. I don't know, I can't think of any, but an eternal peace usually means peace for a couple of years, or peace until peace isn't convenient anymore. And that is very much what happens in this case.
With so few enemies to threaten him, Khosrau seized the opportunity and proved himself worthy of the name Anushirawan, which Iranians still know him by today. But the peace which allowed Khosrau to launch his empire of reforms would soon come to an end. Beleaguered Ostrogoth messengers stumbled into Iran across a Roman border opened by the Treaty of Eternal Peace.
Ostrogoth messengers. They have come a long way. This is part of Justinian's mission to retake the western provinces of the Roman Empire, and they've made their way all the way back to Iran to ask for help. That's pretty remarkable. Shows sort of a line of connection which we often don't see.
They raced along the roads that Khosrau had recently rebuilt to beg for an audience with the Shah. And when the veils lifted to reveal Khosrau on his throne, the messengers spoke. Justinian has sent all of his armies to attack us in the west. Please, help us.
Once again, Justinian pops back up. As I told you, you can't tell the story of Khosrau without Justinian, and vice versa is true as well. These two characters are very important in each other's stories. And so we're touching on Justinian's conquests of the Western Roman provinces. And also, although of course they very closely interact on several occasions, their empires are right next to each other. Even without that, a lot of comparisons are made between Khosrau and Justinian, because both were these enterprising, ambitious reformers who started as soon as they got into power, but the projects that they began were really lifelong projects. I'm curious to see where Khosrau's reign goes, what his legacy is, because Justinian is incredibly intelligent, skillful, and ambitious, and he implemented a lot of reforms, but I am one of those who's a little more critical of Justinian. I think he overextended, particularly with his attempts to reconquer the entire Roman Empire. So I'm curious if Khosrau has some of the same, what I would see as flaws, and how things go near the end of Khosrau's reign. How he leaves, because that's an important thing. I mean, look, we still have to see the rest of Khosrau's time in power, so let's not jump ahead too much. I really don't know where the rest of his reign is going to go. I mean, I know some stuff. But I'm curious to see where this series ends. How he leaves the Empire, and how it continues after him. Because that's a big question with Justinian. So yeah, I've been really enjoying this series. What I know about Khosrau comes from the Eastern Roman perspective and what I know about Justinian in particular. So it's interesting seeing things from the Sassanid perspective, right? If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment, check out the Patreon and channel memberships for exclusive reaction content. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye.